materialize cooperation between the two institutions that have indeed mutual needs that could be developed through further cooperation. And on this, happy to take questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Thierry. I have another question for you. When I was listening to you, you described NATO as a global player in the area of international security. Don't you think NATO should today rethink its guiding policy and innovate its tools in order to be as a main security player in the region? You know, the ambition of the Mediterranean dialogue, which is one of the major instruments of NATO, could not, and Minuto Rizzo was here when we organized this first NAC meeting in Morocco. You were Assistant Secretary of NATO. Which kind of difficulty we had to put all the parties together. Now, NATO wants to go, which looks south, stepping over the Mediterranean. So I think then, don't you think that you should maybe revigorate your tools, try to create some coherence between the Med dialogue and your African policy? I noted, because of the indivisibility of security, the two regions are linked together. So I want you to have your thoughts about this issue.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have an answer, and I have colleagues here who are dealing with those issues. Probably there is a distinction to be made between the Middle East or the MENA region on the one hand. That is probably, in terms of priorities, more priority for NATO when going south than Sub-Saharan Africa. That is certainly less a priority than the former region. In terms of revisiting its policies, NATO is constantly in the process of revisiting what it is trying to do to stabilize different regions, and you now have that concept of projecting stability that partly applies to the south, and it was designed as an instrument that should be applied predominantly to the south. So that's the plan. It's contested, including within NATO. But in terms of outreach to Africa, there is clearly a need to rethink a relationship if it is to be taken at a higher level. I am not sure it should be taken at a strategic level, meaning a certain number of decisions or structures that would be probably premature, but certainly to make it more efficient, so that Sub-Saharan Africa, beyond the MENA region, that should be distinct, so that Sub-Saharan Africa is in the radar screen for NATO, insofar as threats emanating from there have an impact on NATO security.
Okay, thank you, Thierry. I think, as I said earlier, I would like to open, discussion, not only for questions, but also for any, any observation or any contribution to our debate on this question. Yes, you have the floor, sir.
Yes, first, thank you.
Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for both of you for the presentation. I just wanted to make 2 points, perhaps in relation to this panel, and one short point in relation to the previous panel. And I target the audience, meaning those non-African actors here. The first one is, I think both speakers and yourself, the chair, has raised that one. It relates to the partnership. And there are two problems, cardinal problems, if you wish, critical problems in the partnership. And not necessarily with NATO only, actually more has to do with EU and other partnerships. And recently the African Union has done a very extensive, comprehensive assessment of partnership, and I'm reflecting to that. The first one is that partnerships are considered as unequal, the partners. Of course, we know they are not peers in many cases. But if you want to have effective partnership, actually that kind of unequal attitude and inbuilt considerations of being unequal and one receiving, the other one giving, is always counterproductive. The second one is partnership which is not principled also. It's possible, for example, the European Union goes multilateral arrangements. It goes to AU. When it's necessary and is unable to do it with AU, it goes bilateral. And that has happened also to an extent with NATO's intervention in Libya. And the problem arises out of this two big problems. That the first one has to do with we need to base our partnerships, especially on peace and security, under the chapter 8 of the UN Charter. And there is a call for that from AU side, that the UN from distance cannot treat the AU as subordinate, junior partner that will be instructed to do things. And that's proving very problematic. If we see Prodi's report, you will be clear about this detail. And the second one, of course, is the partnership that is going unilateral when necessary from NATO or others. And what we see now is, and it goes to the question that was raised by Terry, that, and also Yusuf, that whether Libya is something that could be handled by AU. In my opinion, Colonel Gaddafi, Libya was too small for him, that he wanted the African continent. Now Libya is too big for African Union. It cannot be managed by African Union. That's a conclusion we have reached a long time ago, that it cannot be handled by African continent alone. And it can contribute a little bit, but it cannot for various reasons. I will take you to the peace, and I think this goes to Terry's point. On peace and security, there is a position by African Union that we cannot go and fund beyond 25% of the peace and security expense, because peace and security, like you say, are indivisible, and there is no African problem, peace and security problem only. As such, the solution has to be global also. The African solution for African problem is limited to that. Last point with relation to the previous, but I think it's appropriate to raise it now, is with regard to all these organized crimes and terrorism. Let me shift the perspective or the prism through which we will look. I want to put the states, the weakness of states, rather than the strengths of the organized criminal networks and the terrorist groups. In my opinion, central to the problem in organized crime, and it has been mentioned by the speakers, but it's not as such an emphasis, is the weakness of the state, not the strengths of the terrorist groups like Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram. If we had a strong government in Nigeria, the whole West Africa would have been different. If we had a better government in Somalia, the situation would have been different. And I think there, the partnership to strengthen states will have a big impact. And the focus of partners should be how to capacitate and change the behavior of the state. The nature of the state in Africa is the most important point, rather than the terrorist groups and also the organized criminals as such, in my opinion.
Thank you. Before giving the floor to the panel, are there any other intervention? Yes. Microphone, please. There. Okay, try. You see, people need... You're not Pavarotti, huh?
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately.
My question is about China. How do you see the increasing presence of this big state in many African states, grabbing lands, creating infrastructures, and creating more influence every day? I don't know if some of you...
Okay. Any more interventions here? Okay, we're going to answer these first questions. I just would like to completely share with you the problem we have when we deal with Europe on partnership. Because the Europeans, they have a difficult process of decision. And sometimes they don't agree. Some parties insist on human rights, others on security, on border controls. I will give only one example, the partnership on migration between Europe and Africa. Some of the Europeans, they insist on the first element of the triptych, which is the border control, fight against illegal migration. And we cannot deal with this issue only through this first element. That's why in our partnership, and you are right, it is an unequal partnership, we insisted on 3 elements. First, the fight against illegal migration and all kind of trafficking. The second is the facilitation of legal migration. And the third element of the partnership was solidarity and development. This is what the Rabat process on migration and development. So, yes, but we need to compromise. I think what's important today with the partnership is we need to compromise. Now, about China, and I give the floor to you, panelists, to respond to the other questions. China has a vision, clear vision since a long time towards Africa, because they see Africa as the second potential growth in the region, so they are investing and so on. They have a vision and strategy towards Africa. So we are not preoccupied. We have to deal with this competence because we are living in a globalized world. So that's why countries like Morocco, for example, are trying to work in Africa because we believe that Africa is the future. Africa it's our continent, you know, and we need to create, you know, wealth, shared prosperity within this vision that we are implementing in Morocco. But other countries are doing also the same. And I think that what is important today, we as Africans, is we need to work on our regional integration. I think that the regional integration, ECOWAS, proves that it was successful in trade, because the most important is how to work, how to promote trade. Trade is the only way how to create jobs and to promote growth. I think this is something that is a priority for us as Moroccans and as Africans. And maybe I give you the floor to respond on the partnership, how you see the partnership, and Yusuf also.
You know, there is a kind of academic answer and then a more practical answer to the issue of partnership. The academic or theoretical answer is the fact that indeed the word partnership implies that one is talking about 2 peers that are partners and that cooperate on different issues. And that is what we are, you know, aspiring to develop between institutions or states. The reality is always different. Always different. Wherever you look at, and if we look at international organizations involved in crisis management or security governance, there is not one example of 2 institutions that would be about, you know, on a par, or maybe you would say that the UN, NATO would be on a par, but then if you look at the military aspects, then NATO is dominant and the EU would be dominated, and if you look at the economic or civilian issues, that would be the other way around. If you look at the UN and NATO, if you look at the EU and the AU, or if you look at NATO and the AU, you always have an institution that tends to dominate either in political terms or in financial terms or in operational terms the other, and that domination is always a kind of a resentment by the one that is dominated, because with domination comes, you know, frustration, and you know, we are all aware of the tension between the European Union and the UN on the debate about the UN being, and the Security Council in particular,